My name is Leon Birdtail, but our original name is Mini Eagletails, and I just had my enrollment change to our original Grobont names, and that's Mini Eagletails. And I belong to the Fights Alone band or clan of the Grobonts. I'm 76 years old, grew up around Lodgepole and sometimes around Hayes. I knew a lot of the old elders. I have it pretty much written down here because I'm getting to the age where I kind of ramble every now and then, but hey, that's being an elder. People understand and that stuff. So, and I sent you a picture that was given to me by my relative Aaron Perry, not the current Perrys that live in Lodgepole, but Marlene and Albert Perry and Bernie and them. They're a different Perry. They're not they don't belong to Aaron Perry and Edwin and those Perrys. Those Perrys belong to the Red Whip, and Red Whip was a clan member of the Fights Alone, or band member of the Fights Alone clan, and he's my blooded grandpa as my dad's uncle, Red Whip, and my dad knew him, and it isn't like he's claiming that, but he knew Red Whip, and so did my uncle, and they're the ones that would tell the story about Red Whip at the Battle of Greasy Grass or the Little Bighorn. So that's how that's an oral story. They relate a lot of oral information to us kids, because we didn't have any television or had a battery operated radio, and we usually saved that for special occasions like Paul Harvey. that was at noon. Things like that, and on Saturday or Thursday night fights, that would be on the radio, and on Saturday would be the Grand Ole Opry. So that's what radio was used for, and that stuff. But other than that, they told stories, oral stories. Like I was surprised that nobody knew the story of Red Whip at the Battle of Greasy Grass. And I was surprised that nobody knew how our Sacrifice Lodge or Sundance Lodge, whatever they want to call it, Big Lodge, and how we got our Sweat Lodge or Little Lodge. I was surprised. I was visiting with him, and we were talking, and I mentioned about the Thunderbird, how we got the Big Lodge, and that stuff. He said, I've never heard that story. Well, that's because a lot of our sacred rituals was not told to outsiders. It was more, they knew that they'd write them down or they might change them. So I heard that, I was told that story many times when I was growing up about how the Thunderbird gave us the Big Lodge and Little Lodge, and that's why the Thunderbird instructed us on how we were to construct the Little Lodge or the Sweat Lodge. We had two doors, one to the east and one to the west, and there was back during the time of that time in our history, there was spirits that wandered all over the earth, and one spirit, very powerful spirit, took over the Grovant tribe camp and lived in a buffalo skull. And he was so powerful, nobody could get rid of him. So one little boy prayed and got the help of our creator, or our creator of everything, Baha, and instructed the Thunderbird sent the Thunderbird to help the little boy get rid of this spirit that was in his buffalo skull. So the Thunderbird spirit, or Thunderbird, gave the little boy instructions on how to build the the Little Lodge, and how they were going to get rid of this spirit, because the Thunderbird couldn't get rid of the spirit alone. He needed the help of the people and this little boy. So this little boy, it's a long story. I got it written. I can send it to you, but it goes through the whole story on how the Thunderbird got rid of the spirit with the help of that little boy and the Sweat Lodge, or the Little Lodge. After all that was done, the spirit got out of that buffalo skull. The Thunderbird instructed the Grovant people, when they're in a lot of trouble, or there's a lot of things happening, what they needed to do was build that Little Lodge with one door facing the east, one door to the west, and taking the buffalo skull that the spirit lived in and putting it by the east door between the fire and the door of the Little Lodge. So, those are the stories that I remember being told, and how the Thunderbird instructed that little boy, the young man, I guess, or young warrior, or how to construct the Big Lodge, the Sacrifice Lodge, and gave him a pipe to use during that Thunderbird, during the Sacrifice Lodge, and how to construct it. Our center pole has a lightning bolt coming down the center. That represents the Thunderbird. That is, I was surprised that nobody knew that. Because, stuff like that wasn't written down. Stories like that, I started to remember them because Jigs Maine asked me, this was back in 2008 or 7, if I knew any stories about how we got our Sundance Lodge. And I said, yeah. I said, hasn't anybody ever mentioned the Thunderbird? And my recent research on that subject is that there's a few stories, but they use the eagle. But that isn't what the old people, the old elders used. They used they referred to the Thunderbird and how he gave them the little lodge and the big lodge. And the outline of the big lodge is in the medicine wheel over in Wyoming. You go up there, you look, and you see what they call the medicine wheel. That's the original outline of our Grovant Big Lodge, the Sacrifice Lodge. And according to the story, that little boy would go up on a hill, and pray and pray and pray. And when you get up there, after you know the story, you get up there and you look around and you say, is this where that little boy came and prayed and prayed and prayed, and the Thunderbird came to him here? So, the stories like that, oral stories like that, are very important nowadays, because we're recapturing our traditional ways, or trying to find our traditional ways, because a lot of times our traditional and cultural ways have been changed or forgotten. Now that we're trying to be Ninan, we want to remember who we are and being proud of who we are. We're not the drunks that hung around beanies or servicemen. A lot of our tribal members developed those survivor behaviors of addiction. That's how they survived, learned to survive the boarding schools and the reservations. I call the reservations internment camps. That's what they are. I belong to the Fights Alone clan or band. And I always wondered why. I always felt like one tribal member over northern Cheyenne, she said, no wonder you're different, you're a warrior. And I thought about it. Maybe she's right. That's really, I speak from the heart. And I don't try to con people or change stuff. I just speak what's in my heart. And a lot of times it gets me in trouble. One very influential white man, he said, Leon, he said, I like you very much. He said, but you got a big mouth. I said, what do you mean I got a big mouth? He said, you tell the truth. He said, if you want to accomplish things, he said, learn to bite your tongue. And I thought about it. I said, well, maybe he's right. So the next time I was negotiating with some higher-ups, I bit my tongue. And son of a gun, it worked. So, that's wisdom. And I didn't learn that growing up in Fort Belknap. I grew up around Lodgepole and spent some time in Hayes during the winter, going to school, going to the mission school, and getting my hands beaten and not being able to go out and use the toilets because they never had outdoor toilets, and they never cleaned them, and the poop was over the top of the toilet seats and that stuff, and the bigger kids would climb up on the rafters and take a shit down. Hey, that's the mission school. That's how we were treated as children. A lot of bullying by the descendants, the older kids, the descendants of the little shell. I mean, those older kids really bullied us younger tribal members and that stuff. I mean, it wasn't good. Lodgepole was different. there was hardly any bullying. In fact, all the older kids kind of looked out for us younger kids. And I was thinking about the feather game or the hand games. Why do we use pup? And how is it prepared? Well, they just didn't go out and kill a dog. The pup was sacred. It was sacredly used in the feather game because that was given to one grieving man that was grieving for his family and his wife that was captured. And he'd go out and pray and cry for years, for months and months, and until the spirits and God, Baha, pitied him and gave him that, I guess, gave him the information on how to locate his wife and family. And they told him how to prepare the pup. To prepare the pup is that they got to take a pup that is just getting teeth and not have eaten any food, but they still are nursing, and they gotta kill it quick without any blood coming out of its mouth. If blood comes out of its mouth, then it's not sacred. He had to do that, and had to stuff the pup's mouth with sage every night before he went to sleep. And he was instructed when that in the morning when he wakes, the pup would be facing the direction that he's supposed to go to find his family and his wife. So he followed the instructions and did exactly what he was told. And each morning that pup would be facing the direction of where he was supposed to go, where his wife is. So he did that every morning, and he found his wife. He was so that's why we use pup. I remember back in Lodgepole when I was maybe 4 or 5 years old. 4 or 5 years old. My dog, she had some puppies. Her name was Queenie, and one of the elderly elders was looking around for pups. They were going to have a hand game or a feather game, and she needed some pups. So she asked my dad, and my dad said, "Well, ask him." And asked me, and I said, "Well, I guess." I just and she went over and looked at the pups and made sure that they didn't eat food, and she checked their mouth. They were just getting teeth and that stuff. And she had a big diamond willow stick or diamond willow with her, and she put it down on the ground, and she just took that, put that pup's neck on that willow and just stepped on it quick, and the pup was gone, was dead, and there was no blood out of its mouth. So she took 3 of them and stuff. So that's how I know. I'm not quoting from a book or from somebody else's stories. I've seen these. And last night, preparing for this interviewing, I was thinking about how many tribal members we have in Fort Belknap that have the original names. Very few. And I was thinking about white cows, Ironmans, tax difference. Very few of them still have the original names of their tribal names. Like, I was thinking about Curlyhead. My dad knew him well. And when Curlyhead, that picture of Curlyhead's wife, gonna boil that pup. Well, it looks like you look at the pup, it doesn't look like it's more than 4 or 5 weeks old, or maybe less. And it's not a dog. It's not. It looks like it's a pup. So she was cooking it for a sacred dinner, and during the picture of Red Whip and his witch call, they had that pup head. Well, that's a pup head. That's not a dog head, and that stuff is. And the pup head was really sought after piece and that stuff, and they would give that specially to someone that is I guess what the feather game or the hand game is held for, and that stuff. So, things like this, I don't know if it's lost or people just don't want to share that information. Like my great-grandpa, Eater or Running Bear. I mean, he had spirits that took care of him. And some of the stories that were told about him, and they he was well known around Fort Belknap. Him and I sent you a picture of my relatives. Ted Iitaanɔɔn'i is his grandson, is my uncle, and he kind of looked out and took care of Ted. Him and Ted would be moving from Old Hayes out to our place out in Lodgepole. He'd break his bed down and they'd carry it. They'd drag it all the way back down to his house in Lodgepole, and that stuff, and some crazy stories about him and some of the stuff he would do and that stuff. So stories like that are oral, and I didn't know him, so I had no idea. I just heard the stories about him, and that's when the Virginia Flannery's book came out. He's mentioned in there and stuff. He was a great warrior, a war chief, and that stuff, warrior and that stuff, and the warriors sought to go with him on when he would go out and steal horses, or go out and I guess fight with some the Sioux or the Crow or the Blackfeet and that stuff. They sought to be and if he was displeased with somebody, he would dance around him like a dog and raise his leg and pee on him, or like he was peeing on him, and that young warrior would fall down and start crying because of the disgrace of things like that. That's how his medicine was. That's what he was told he had to do. People that or men, warriors that had war medicine and that stuff, they were instructed on how to use that medicine and stuff. It's like when they would during the sacrifice lodge, they'd have to prepare. They'd have to go and they'd fast for 4 days by themselves. They didn't have a group of people going up and sitting around and talking and being BSing and that stuff. No, they went up and sacrificed. They would pray and pray without any kind of water or food. And I guess, according to the oral stories I heard, some of those fasting would bring in these thunderstorms. The Thunderbird would bring in those thunderstorms there'd be lightning hitting all by them and that stuff. And if that didn't scare them, then on the fourth day they would be given a name. Their name, like Red Whip, Kingfisher, all those names like that. Those weren't. They didn't select them. They were given those names. Now that comes to where I wanted to really discuss what I seen happen that I think is one of the problems we have in our tribe. That is name given. I've seen where they would take somebody's family name and give it to a person that wasn't even part of that family or relatives and stuff, and wouldn't even ask. I mean, those names that were given traditionally, they had a spiritual connection to that name, to that spirit of that person that owned that name. If that person of that own, this is what I was told. If the name you're given, if the person that owned that name before you is gone, then their spirit will look out for you. And if you're not supposed to have that name, then you have bad luck for you and your family and that stuff. And one of my nieces asked me if there was a ceremonial name for Grove. I said, no. You didn't have a ceremonial name. You had your name like Curlyhead. He's what a lot of them would call that they refer to him as Babats. Think about it. If you understand Grobon, look up what that means and stuff, and you'd laugh. You'd say, "Oh, nickname." Well, that's which call, but Curly Head. I don't know where he got that, how he got that name, but it was not a surname like white men. They have a surname like we have nowadays, and that stuff. So everybody knew whose brother was brothers, whose were brothers, and who were sisters, and that stuff. And just like my clan or my band that I belonged to, those are paternal. You belong to your father's clan or band, and if they married into that band, then the kids of that family couldn't marry the mother's clan or band. So it was very restrictive in that way and that stuff. So, and I gave you information on where to get the information that information and that stuff that was written by other than Virginia Flannery. I read her books, when they first had them at the BIA and given them out and that stuff. And a lot of it was true, but some people exaggerated, and like Frozens. Now everybody wants to be a Frozen because on Virginia Flannery's book, it really gives a rosy picture or a status to the Frozen. But the Frozen is a nickname for the Plume band or the Eagle Plume band or clan. The nickname from the Frozen was that during the winter months, you couldn't expect to get any meat or eat from the Frozens because they'll say, our meat's frozen, can't feed you. That was a nickname. They'd laugh. And just like my my band or clan is called Nighthawks, and a lot of the nicknames is Fart Hawks, because the noise that a nighthawk would make when they're flying and they come down and they kind of have that swoosh and that stuff. Well, that's what they kind of called a fart hawk, in Grovepond, and all and at the stands alone, fights alone clan. They were kind of like the policemen of the tribes. They were the very warrior-like clan and band. And when they'd have a celebration or really like, say, what they call a powwow nowadays or celebration back in those days, if they needed their kids to behave, they'd say, I heard a fart hawk and that stuff around here. They're around here. The Nighthawks are around here. And that would settle those kids right down, or the people that were making, doing crazy things and that stuff. And they would kind of patrol around, take care of things. I mean, back then, the alcohol was just being introduced. And there were a few that used it. The Nighthawks would have them leave the area and that stuff. So it is kind of a witchcraft. And I was looking at Mr. Doney's research on the policemen of the early policemen of the tribes. You look at that, 90% of those, except for the Assiniboines, are from the Fights Alone clan or Fights Alone band. Red Whip, Fisher, just naming some of them. It's all there. And I was thinking, well, shoot, I never heard that Red Whip was a tribal police officer or tribal police. And then it just dawned on me. No, those are the clan members of the Fights Alone clan or the Nighthawks. So things like that is not written down, and I recall when some of the researchers would come to Fort Belknap and talk with some of the people, some of the elders. Their comments was such and such was talking to some Nihata, and they were given some crazy information, meaning showing off and that stuff, and they'd laugh and that stuff. So it's just you gotta be really when you read information such as the Virginia Flannery's, which her writings, her research is so Christian oriented or Catholicism oriented. It's kind of like almost, is it believable? But today, it's better than nothing. At least you have some people wanting to follow her research, but there's also other research earlier that is more accurate and stuff about our people, because we are one of the last tribes that contacted and worked with the white men. We were very, very warlike. We didn't live among the white people and that stuff just like I was thinking about some stories, oral stories that I heard when I was growing up. I didn't know Bull Lodge, but I heard a couple of stories about him. This one winter, during a snowstorm, one of the trading posts or the stores in Fort Belknap, Bull Lodge comes and asked if he can trade for some sugar. The lady that her husband was the owner, and she was she asked him, what do you got to trade? He said, I don't know. He said, what do you want? She said, I want some fresh choke cherries on a branch. And this was in midwinter. And he always wore, I guess he wore a black scarf around his neck. He took off his black scarf and he put it over his hand and his arm, and he pulled it off, and there was a great big branch of black choke cherries. And that woman's, this was from the trader. She said she was so surprised. She gave him 2 pounds of sugar and took those choke cherries. Stories like that. I don't know if they're written down anywhere, but it was just passed down and that stuff. And other stories like that, growing up being an Indian, it was really hard because I'm dark-skinned, and we were there's several of us that were dark-skinned that couldn't fit in with I want to say the light-skinned ones. Yeah, light-skinned ones. Like stiff arms, white cows, wings, Hazigos. Most of the Assiniboines, they kind of married each other, and they were, a lot of them were not light skinned. Long Foxes, my relative Richard Long Fox, I and him, we used to have to defend ourselves quite a bit and that stuff. And as you see, that picture I sent, a lot of my on my grandma's side, there's quite a, there's she was kind of mixed blood herself, my grandma, and that stuff. And she was married twice. Her first husband was Lone Bear, and from there she's, Ted Eating Bear is her youngest, and that stuff. That's my uncle, and all those people in that picture, Katie Longhorse, all those are all my blooded relatives, and that stuff. On the Lone Bear side, the Boy family. The Boy is my uncle, not blooded uncle, but uncle by marriage. He was married to my aunt, Ursula Lone Bear. And so, from that family, there's a lot of relatives and stuff. And Skinners, from Skinners, I'm not really related to old Skinner, but his wife, that was my grandma's niece. No, it was my dad's aunt. So out of there, cauliflowers and couple of family, or a family from Brocky family, Leo Brocky, his family, and Ted Brocky, and that's Madeline's two oldest sons and that stuff. So, and it's really, all that stuff seems to be lost. Davy Belcourt, passes a lot of information down and stuff, but a lot of that is written information from interviews. My relative Preston Stiffon had a lot of information, and we were discussing. Him and old Fred Gone, we were discussing the Thunderbird story, and they agreed that that's true. That's a true. That's how we got our sweat lodges and our big lodge or sacrifice lodge is from the Thunderbird. That's why that bolt of lightning is down the center pole. And this current lodge that we got was given to us by the Assiniboines from Canada. Was given to Joe Ironman by the Assiniboines. So that really isn't a Grovant sacrifice lodge, but it's a Sundance Lodge and that stuff. I guess run by the Grovants and that stuff, but it's just I guess it's just I don't know what to say. My brother-in-law, that means special relationship in Grovant. When you say brother-in-law, that means you have a special relationship with someone. That my brother-in-law, Joe Ironman, which he called me his brother-in-law too, was I don't want to say anything disgraceful, but he was a really good man and a good tribal member and spiritual man, trying to bring back our old ways. When I first, I left Fort Belknap when I was about 14, 15 years old, but I keep going back every now and then and that stuff. And the last time I was back there, I was the director of the CDC program. That's when Joe lived out in Lodgepole, and the flat pipe was kept in a little house outside of his house. So I go and I go in and visit him, and I visit him first, and I told him I said, come to visit the flat pipe. I used to go with my dad when he'd go to Joe's dad, old Iron Man or Tall Jack, and they would pray, and old Tall Jack had that bundle right over his bed and that stuff, and there was certain protocol and stuff. What I was instructed, you couldn't go in the front of it, or you couldn't touch it. You had to sit and say nothing and that stuff. So I'd go with my dad. We'd visit, and they'd spend hours praying and talking and that stuff. So I was talking with Joe, and I said, "Where's I come to visit the pipe? Where at the bundle?" He said, "Oh, it's out in that little house out there." I said, "Oh, okay." I said, "I'm gonna go out and visit." And he said, "Okay." So I went out, and what I seen brought tears to my eyes on how it was kept.
don't have clothes.
I mean, I remember things so different. When I went and seen that bundle, it looked like it was an old fat pig wrapped up in a yellow cloth, and there was cigarette butts all over in there. And I was thinking, oh my God, it was hard. So I just got down, picked up all the cigarette butts and all the tobacco that was laying around there. I made a little fire and I burnt it. And so I went back in and I talked with Joe. I said, Joe, I was visiting that pipe, the bundle. I said, it shouldn't be kept that way. And he said, I know. He said, I'm not the keeper. He said, I'm not the feather pipe man. And that's when his wife spoke up and said, yeah, he can't be because he did something wrong when he was a kid. And I said, oh yeah. I said, but it shouldn't be kept. I told him I picked up all the tobacco and cigarette butts and that stuff. And I said, as I recall, when they bring cloth to give to the bundle pipe, they would pray with the cloth, and then they'd go out and put it in the hills and leave it there. They would not wrap that bundle around that. They would not put that cloth on that bundle and that stuff. I said, and it was kind of sad. It was sad. It was really hard to see it. When I used to go visit it with my dad, I maybe was 5, 6 years old, something like that. And it was kind of a hard thing to see. But growing up as there in Fort Belknap, being an Indian, that was one of the questions you wanted me to answer. That's very hard. Because the more I got away from Fort Belknap, the more I understand what it was to be an Indian. The Christianity or Christians, I'm not saying all Christians are bad, but how they demonized us tribal people, us indigenous people. We were demonized by the Europeans, the whites. We experienced a genocide. I didn't realize that until I got a higher education, understanding what genocide was, understanding how the Jewish people experienced the same thing that we experienced. But only thing, in my graduate work, one of the survivors of the internment camps in Nazi Germany, she sat down with me and we were talking. She said, we are so similar. He said, but the difference is we got out of our internment camps. But you indigenous people or you Indians are still in your internment camps. And being in the internment camps and experiencing the genocide, we developed survivor's behavior, genocidal survivor's behavior. And that is what you see today in our tribal communities, whether it's urban or reservation. That's why we are the worst. Our worst enemies is because of that, of those behaviors. Those behaviors of one is what is the old crabs in a bucket syndrome. Nobody tries to lift each other out of that bucket. They all pull each other down, because that's survival. That's how we were learned to survive today. And we need to teach our young people of who they are, their identity, not the ones that came home from the boarding schools, which already developed the survivor's behavior and the genocidal internment of trying to change their, what they call, destroy the Indians, save the men. Well, out of that, alcoholism, child abuse, domestic violence, results of that. And now it's not just alcoholism, it's an addiction to all these drugs. So we have to start teaching our young people of who they are. Not saying that powwows are the traditional, are our tradition. Powwows, yeah, they're good, but that doesn't mean you're a traditional person. Your behavior is the traditional way. How you treat your relatives, how you treat the community members, and how honest you are. We're having such a hard time getting transparency in our governments. And they still treat us like we have no educational background, to where all they want is our thumbprint, instead of informing us why are we putting our thumbprint down on this document. We have the water compact that is really controversial. Nobody understands the federal water laws. And I did some research on federal water laws. The tribal members, if they understood and was given the accurate information on these on the water compact and how it's going to affect them, they would say no. We'll stay with the Winters doctrine and that stuff. They wouldn't give up their water rights. So, things like that, they dangle a few dollars in front of the tribe's tribal government and that stuff, and they don't realize that they put in the contract that it's cost reimbursement, meaning you don't get the money. You go build it, and then we'll reimburse you for the cost. It's really I went to a meeting over in Billings a couple of years ago when they were discussing it, and the tribal chairman at that time was Works. He contacted me and asked me, and we were shooting emails back and forth. And I came across a study that was done by some attorney, given to the council, and it never got to the council. I mean, things like that just shouldn't be happening, because today we live in two worlds: the white world and the indigenous world, and we got to survive in the white world, because that's where the money. If you got money, you got your freedom. So it's being an Indian and understanding all that is hard. And getting to that point, because growing up, I didn't have any role models of being able to survive off the reservation. and stuff. Like education, 8th grade, people just wanted to get they're legally the 8th grade or 16 years old where they don't have to go to school. Well, if some of them that didn't hang around, if the ones that, I guess I'm rambling here, but the ones that hung around the BIA and IHS, their families, they made sure that their kids went to school and got a high school diploma minimum and that stuff. But us, the ones like me and some of the ones that I grew up with didn't understand that. We were surviving from day to day and stuff. We didn't have parents that worked for IHS or the BIA and that stuff, or the county or whatever and that stuff. So we just survived. But today it's different because we are getting better educated, better understanding of how the system works, how to use the sovereignty that we have, tribal sovereignty that we have, but not misusing it, but how to use it to benefit our people. Not just keeping some of the past tribal officials out of jail and all that stuff, but to benefit our people, economically benefit them, because that's tribal sovereignty is an economic tool nowadays and that stuff. And if we start using it, we can really accomplish a lot. But growing up to a point where I understand that, in later life, and being a warrior from a warrior clan, understanding that when I retired out of IHS federal service. I worked for him for 10 years, and I felt like I was when I first went to work for him, and I had to carry around that identification. I felt like I was a turncoat to my people. And I felt like I was, because I seen the government as the enemy of our people. And I couldn't understand how a lot of some of the tribal members that belong to certain tribes really cherished being a commissioned Corps officer. I was thinking, geez, I mean, they're still overseeing the internment camps that our people are in. So I'm, growing up and getting to that point to where I want my grandchildren and my children to thrive. My children, I have a daughter that has a master's. I have a son that has a master's. I have another son that is going for a doctorate. I have another son that is an All-American in college. Was All-American in college, and all their children are starting to thrive. But still, it's hard for them because they are still associated and with the internment camps and that stuff. Maybe one day they'll look at it and say, well, let's go change it. But as of today, it's really hard because most of our leadership is not knowledge in financial or administrative in that stuff. And going back to the clan system or our bands. Our bands, they had their bands in a clockwise order, facing east. On the east side, going south was the plume. And then it went all the way around to the north, the east, the west, the east, the south, the west, the north, and back to the east. And on that east, other side of that east switch call, would be the northeast side, was the Fight Salone clan, or the Nighthawks. And so, this knowledge is really really important nowadays. And when I was years ago, when I was telling the story about the Thunderbird, how the Thunderbird gave us the big lodge and the little lodge, one tribal member said, "You be careful on who you tell that story to. They'll steal it from you." I said, "Steal it? They can. I freely give it to people. It isn't where I'm afraid somebody's going to take credit for it. No. The elders told me that story for some reason. At that time, that story was told to me for some reason. Maybe it's because of today. Because all the methamphetamine and all the drug addiction and the fighting and abuse and neglect in our communities. Maybe we need to look at it and say, hey, our cultural ways is the ways to solve this. And just a point I want to make is when I was growing up, they used to have two celebrations, one in Lodgepole and one in Hayes. New Year's in Lodgepole. And during that time, there was maybe one or two dancers, and they'd feed and have a big, big feed meat and beef and soup and coffee and that stuff. But the majority of the people, they used to have a bullpen, what they called a bullpen at the old hall in Lodgepole. And you go back there, they'd be all drunk, drinking, and stuff. And I remember Fred Hallcover and Joe Plumage and Pete Gone were the tribal police, and they'd go around, and the guys they'd hide their jugs of wine in their belt and their stomachs, and they'd go with their billy clubs and just hit them in the stomach with their billy clubs and just smash their jugs and that stuff. And then outside, they'd be all drunk outside, and a very few dancers sober inside. But you take it today, the change that has come, it's completely opposite. There is not too many people that are using alcohol in these celebrations or around them. Why? It's because of the culture. Most everybody is really looking at their culture, and saying it's not our cultural way to be using alcohol or drugs, or beating on our kids, or beating on our wives, or wives beating on their husbands, wives beating on their children, mothers beating on their children. No, that's not our way. I remember when I was growing up, there's no such thing as a foster home. Really, there was no such thing as a foster home. Kids, if they didn't have anybody taking care of them, they'd go to a relative, and they'd live there, or the relative would keep them. Nobody would say anything. They'd just be one of the family and that stuff. It's just something that BIA social workers started. I mean, the BIA social workers used to carry around handcuffs for kids. Now, do you believe that? I mean, and we kind of model our health care, our social health care after the BIA social workers? That's scary. CPS. There's nothing you can do to them. They can't be held accountable. The social workers can't be held accountable, tribal or state, because they got that sovereign immunity or continued immunity. All they have to say is, we were doing our job. We were trying to do our job, and that's it. No matter how many families they destroy, how many kids that have died because of their actions. So that's how it is. How it was when I was growing up. We didn't have foster homes. I remember when the BIA would take the kids to the boarding schools. The old agents say there, right there, that little turnaround, that would be filled with buses from all different boarding schools. I remember that. I was there. I didn't go to boarding school, but I was there. My dad was smart enough to take me and my younger brother off the reservation, so the social worker, BIA social workers, couldn't get our name and have us put in boarding schools. I remember seeing 5, 6-year-old kids being put on the bus, and their parents and their mother and father died, crying. And the ones that didn't show up at their what's called, they had a list. The BIA police were right there. They check off names, and the social worker would check off names. If they weren't there, they put out a warrant for them to have them picked up. I mean, that's what we grew up with. That's what I grew up with. And this is what the results of our communities is facing, the results from there. Everybody that I know that during those days, I remember August 23rd, or was it August 22nd? That's when they take them to the boarding schools. And everybody would be over, everybody that had kids, that, especially the little ones, that had to go to boarding school, they'd be over in Harlem drinking. They drink for, I don't know, a couple of days, sometimes a week. I mean, that's sad. And they'd get back May 22nd of each year. Now, that's how I grew up. I didn't grow up in any kind of fantasy saying that my family, that I've seen a lot of traditional people. I've seen people that were surviving and using some of their culture to survive. I mean, most of our families married into the miners out of Zorgman and Landusky, and over the Cowboys at Circle C. That's where Red Whip's son-in-law was Perry. He worked for the Circle C and stuff. And my dad worked for the Circle C as a worked with their horses and stuff. Not after Circle C came I think that other big cattle company, but that's how they survived. That's how my uncle Ted Eating Bear, he was working for Matador, and that's who came after Circle C, Matador, and that's during the flu epidemic of 1919. I think it was 1960. It was one of those years. And my grandma was they had a camp set for them by the IHS hospital there, across where Old Booze is a store there, but across from the Circle, from the gas station. That's where they had the flu camp, and my grandma was in there, and nobody was allowed to see him, and they couldn't stop my uncle Ted. He said, no, he said, my mother's in there, and I got her some food. I'm going to go feed her. So he took food into there, and he got the flu, and he died. So these are things like that. Like I was surprised when I went back to Hayes, drove by Hayes, and they had the ghost pines all full houses when I was growing up, and we lived in Hayes in the winter, and I don't think we lived there in the summer. No, in the winter and that stuff, we couldn't even go around the foot of those pines. He said, no, you stay away from it. That's a burial ground. That's the ghost pines. So all through there I snuck up there a couple of times, but there would be dishes there and old clothes and blankets and all that stuff. When somebody passed to the other side, they'd put their stuff out there. They'd go put it out and that stuff. And so those were the days, and there's a lot of burial places on the hills around Lodgepole there and that stuff. They just go put their bodies out in the witch. They didn't put them in the ground. They'd lay them out on the hills and that stuff. Like my grandpa, my great grandpa Running Bear, that dry lake there, that saddle there, and there's some sand rocks. He was placed right on them and that stuff. That's his burial place and that stuff. So things like that. You knew when you're growing up. There was no big new information. You just knew and that stuff. So growing up there was hard, but come to think of it, it was kind of safe, because kids could go walk to their relatives miles away and they'd be safe and that stuff. So white man or Aaniiih stories. Now those were really told when I was at night, when I was a kid and that stuff, before bedtime and that stuff, to tell those stories and that stuff. Some of them were really interesting, like how Aaniiih brought summer to the Gros-Ventres, how he got rid of the little people about there's some really crazy ones. Some I don't want to mention. Fart weed story. Some of them were really crazy, and also some of them were powerful. How he had this special gift to do things, but not always spiritual, but do things. That's stuff. I guess power and name giving. Now that is scary. I mean, that is scary when people give names like me. My Grobon name is Child of the Beaver, because I was given that when I was probably about 4 or 5 years old, if I remember. I used to be able to swim in the beaver dams around our creek, and my dad and uncle said, "Geez, he's really a child of a beaver. He looks like a beaver out there swimming around and that stuff." So they gave me that name. So that's my Grobon name, and it isn't a ceremonial name. It's just a name that I had when I was a kid, and that stuff. And now my name is Many Eagle Tails. That is my relative that signed the Treaty of 1886 or something like that. He was there and put his thumbprint down, or his X on there. It's kind of nice to be able to discuss this. We were instructed when we were kids, or told, don't try to acquire any type of spiritual power, because that'll come back and be destructive to you or your family if you don't do it right. And it's really, you see, let me give you an example. My relative, Madeline Cauliflower, at one of my family's relatives' last funeral that I attended there, where Madeline was, she comes up and she tells me, she said, "What's going on with your bird tails? You're dropping like flies." Because within 1 year, 11 of us passed away. 11. And I said, "Well, what do you think, Madeline?" I said, "You think it's because some of them are trying to acquire medicine?" She said, "Well, we were told that when we were kids. We don't seek stuff like that, because we eventually pay." So that's kind of a warning to whoever listens to this. Don't seek medicine, because you have to give up something. And if you don't know what you're doing, it'll just take your family members left and right. I've seen that starting to happen. And I just want to thank you for inviting me for this interview.